Tonight, we want to pick up our study in the life of Joseph, and we're entitling this or subtitling this series, Path to the Palace. And the purpose of this class, these lessons, is to look at Joseph's journey to the palace. And just like Joseph, we all have a purpose. And we all have a palace that we're headed to. Joseph's palace was in Pharaoh's house. And the purpose of Joseph being in the palace in Pharaoh's house was to preserve God's people. Well, your palace may be CEO of a business. Your palace may be principal of a school. Your palace may be, President of the United States. Whatever your palace is, wherever it is you are headed to, whatever the final destination that God has for you, He has a purpose for you. And the journey from where you are now to that palace is such that you have to make some stops along the way. And the reason why you have to make stops along the way, just like Joseph, is because there are some lessons that you have to learn before you get to where God wants you to be. And so we're going to talk about these stops that Joseph made. In our last class, we looked at the timeline. We began the timeline of Joseph's journey. We said that Joseph began his journey when he was 17 years old, right? And he was in his father's house. And where he's going to end up is the palace in Pharaoh's house, but we're going to look at the stops that he made and the lessons that he learned en route to that palace, okay? And we're going to apply these lessons to our lives and see how that they will help us when we're on our way to our palace. First stop we talked about in our last class was the first stop he made was in the pit. Isn't that right? You remember the story? Joseph's brothers were jealous of him. Why? Because Joseph was his father's favorite, because his father openly showed that he was his favorite, because Joseph had gifts that God had given him, and Joseph was boastful. He was not shy about, flaunting his gifts before his brothers, and his brothers were to the point where they could not stand the sight of Joseph. Let me just say this. Joseph was 17 years old at the pit. 17 years old, at 17 years old, there are a lot of things you don't know. You don't know everything when you're 17 years old, contrary to what some 17-year-olds today think. And when I was 17, and I'm sure when you were 17, you thought you knew more than you actually knew too, didn't you? But you see, the lessons that we learn in life, we learn from life. And 17 years is not enough of life for you to know everything you need to know. Isn't that right? Amen. And so we need to be mindful of the fact that Joseph, at the beginning of his journey, did not know everything he needed to know. We also talked about the fact that Joseph came from a dysfunctional family. Like a lot of families, dysfunctional. Why was his family dysfunctional? Well, when you look at the story, Joseph had 11 brothers, one sister, by 4 different women, and they all lived in the same household. That's drama, y'all. I don't care how you slice it, that's drama. That's soap opera drama right there. Isn't that right? But here is the point, and here's what I think this story teaches us about that. It doesn't matter where you start. Doesn't matter what you come from or where you come from. God can still use you. This story demonstrates the fact that Joseph started from a place where most people wouldn't have given him a shot of success because of where he come from, right? And many of us come from places that if people had to judge us based on where we come from, we wouldn't have a shot at success. But with God in the mix, everything and anything is possible. Isn't that right? But let's look at this journey of Joseph. We said that Joseph, his first stop was the pit, right? We also said that each one of these stops, there is a lesson to be learned. What was the lesson that Joseph learned in his first stop at the pit? Anyone know? Let me set the stage for you. I'm going to help you. Joseph was 17, right? His daddy's favorite. He was gifted by God, right? Would you say that Joseph had a little bit of an ego problem? You see, he had a little bit of pride in him. Now, he's 17 years old. Keep that in mind, right? And when you're 17 and you got it going on like that, you tend to think that, you're all out in a bag of chips. So the lesson that Joseph learned in that pit was what? Humility. Joseph learned humility down in that pit. Let me show you why. Turn to Genesis chapter 37, verse 24. Someone else get Genesis 42, verse 21. Genesis chapter 37, verse 24.
Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh.
You in verse 24, sis? 24?
Oh, I'm sorry.
37, 24?
And they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked. And behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicy and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. I just wanted verse 24. I want to set the stage here. Remember, Joseph is coming from a place where he had everything he wanted, right? He was his daddy's favorite and all that. But when they put him into the pit, the Bible specifically says, and the pit was empty. There was no provision for him. And there was no water in the pit. Turn to chapter 41. What did I say, 41, 42? 42, verse 21. Now, I'm just fast-forwarding a little bit because I want you to see this is his brothers reflecting back on when he was in the pit. I want you to see what Joseph's state of mind was when he was in that pit. 42, verse 21. Who has it? Okay.
Then they said to one another, We are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore, this distress has.
Thank you. You see what his state of mind was? When he was down in that pit, he learned a lesson. He learned that he didn't have it going on. He had no provisions. It was cold. It was wet. There was no water. And he was pleading with his brothers. But they wouldn't hear him. I'd say he learned a lesson down in that pit. And if we think about the pits in our lives, if we think about the stop that we've made, and if you hadn't made it yet, keep living, you will. Amen. Okay? It's inevitable. But if you've already been in the pit, if you've already spent some time in the pit, think about the lesson that you learned in the pit. One of the saddest things is for God to put you somewhere and you not get anything out of it. You don't get the lesson that God intended for you to get out of it. Amen. Problem with that is he's going to put you down in there again or leave you down there until you do get the lesson. Amen. So how long you stay there depends on how quickly you get the message and the lesson. Isn't that right? So the lesson that he learned down in that pit was humility. Now, why is that important? Because in order to succeed, we need humility. One of the worst things is to have somebody with a big head running stuff. And I think all of us know someone or know of someone who's got a big head and they're in charge. That's a bad combination. But you know what? The book says in James chapter 4, verse 6, that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Isn't that right? So let's look at, and this is where we're going to pick up tonight, the second stop that Joseph makes in his journey. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 39. And I need someone to read for me Genesis 39, verses 1 through 6. Whoever's going to read it, use the microphone. Let's look at the second stop he made.
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. Read on.
Down to, that's verse 6.
Oh, to 6. Oh,
Down
yeah,
to
okay.
6.
So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Then he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance.
Thank you. Before we get into this, can anyone tell me what the second lesson was that Joseph learned on his stop, just based on the verses that we've read so far? Why? Let's go with him.
God found favor with him.
Okay. Would you say, sis?
He became a manager of Potiphar's house.
The two lessons that Joseph learned at this stop, he learned management skills, and he learned that God, if he's faithful to God, God will be with him no matter what his circumstances are. That's the lesson that we learn. If we are faithful to God, and when we get into the story a little deeper, we're going to see that that faith was tested. It was challenged, and so will ours. But Joseph learned at this stop some management skills. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, when he gets to the palace, he's going to need these skills, because these skills that he's going to learn in Potiphar's house are going to be useful to him when he gets into the palace to fulfill the purpose that God has for him. You see? So all of the lessons that we learn, brothers and sisters, will be useful to us when we get to where God has for us to get to. But he learned that if you're faithful to God, now this is deep, because how many of us are now or have been in some place, some situation, that is really not a good place? Joseph was betrayed, sold by his brothers into slavery to some Ishmaelites, and then resold by the Ishmaelites into slavery in Potiphar's house. Away from his home now, away from his father who loved him so much, away from his country, away from his family, all the way down into Egypt in another man's house as a slave. That's not good circumstances, right? But the Lord was with Joseph. Not only was the Lord with Joseph, Paul just read, the Lord blessed Joseph in Potiphar's house. He blessed Potiphar's house because Joseph was in it. He blessed all of Potiphar's business because Joseph was in it. You see? How many of y'all's jobs are blessed because you are there? How many of your houses are blessed because you are there? And you know what I like about Potiphar? Potiphar recognized the fact that his house was blessed because Joseph was there. And he utilized Joseph. You see? Employers, pay attention to your employees, because your job, your business may be blessed because there is some godly person in there. And if you find a godly person in your employee, utilize that person, because through him, God is going to bless you. You know what I thought about when I read this? When I thought about how God blessed Potiphar's house and all that he had because of Joseph, I thought about our ancestors in slavery in this country. And I thought about how many masters, slave owners, whose business thrived because some godly slave person was there in that house. I don't have any documentation. I hadn't had time to research it, but I would be willing to bet my life that some slave owners prospered because some godly slave was in their household. And here's the point. No matter where you are, if you're faithful to God, he'll be faithful to you. And he'll bless what you have. And he'll bless whose lives your life touches. That's some deep stuff, y'all. Yes, sir. Isn't that powerful? Yes. But do you see how these stops that Joseph, he's making, and the lesson that he's learned, when you see when he get to where God intends for him to be, how that's going to benefit him. But let's go a little further, because he's in Potiphar's house, right? He's blessed. Potiphar is blessed. His house is blessed. His business is blessed. But be sure, brothers and sisters, that wherever there's a blessing, Satan is around. Amen. And Satan's objective is to steal your blessing. And in this case, in this story, Satan comes in the form of Potiphar's wife. Read the story. Let's pick it up. Verse number 7 down through verse 20. Someone who has it.
Start at 7.
Go ahead, sis.
7? Okay. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined.
Thank you, sis. That's good. We're going to stop right there. 'Cause remember this phrase: after the dove comes the devil. Remember when Jesus was tempted? 40 days and 40 nights? Well, back up before then. When Jesus was baptized of John the Baptist, remember? When Jesus came up out of the water, the Bible says that the heavens opened up, a dove descended on Jesus. The Spirit of the Lord descended on Jesus as a dove. A voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased." And right after that, the next verse says, then cometh the devil to tempt him. Without exception, every time you have a mountaintop experience, look for a valley experience. Every time you experience the dove, look for the devil. In this case, Joseph was on the mountaintop. Joseph had found favor with Potiphar. He was put in charge of Potiphar's entire estate. Nothing was, denied Joseph except Potiphar's wife. But that's what the devil used. That's who the devil used to get to Joseph. Now, I found it interesting in verse number 7 when it says, and it came to pass after these things that the master's wife set her eyes upon him. After what things? After Joseph had been made, elevated, successful, given a lot of power, a lot of prestige. He wasn't looking all that good to her until he got something. There's a word for that these days. Gold digger. But what I can't understand is this is Potiphar's wife. So she already has everything. So why is she, Don't make no difference. Don't make no difference. Where that microphone at? Put that in his mouth so he can say that again. Say that again.
Don't make no difference. I mean, not only that, what did the scripture tell me is he was handsome, well built. Mm-hmm. Maybe your husband wasn't so.
But you know what? He looked a lot better to her after he found all of this favor. And he's young, young buck. The Bible says that Potiphar's wife was after Joseph every day. Every day she was pushing up on him. Every day. All day. Isn't that right? And the Bible says that he resisted her. And I said in the first class, the first time that you remember back in April, I asked the question for the brothers. How many of you brothers could resist a fine Egyptian sister as she was throwing it at you every day? Not everybody could do that. But Joseph did it. And why did he do it? Because he was committed to his God and he was committed to his master. Two qualities that we need in order to succeed, so that we can get, once we get to our palace, we would be equipped for what the Lord wanted us to have. Now, the Bible said that she was on him, she was after him, right? But he resisted. It takes strength for a young man to resist a woman coming after him like that. Why did he resist? Why did he resist? Because of his commitment, right? He understood and appreciated the fact that he had been entrusted with a tremendous responsibility. He told her that your husband have entrusted everything to me. He doesn't even know what's going on in his house, except what he's eating. Everything else he's leaving in my hands. And the only thing in his house that he denied me having is you. And isn't that ironic? The one thing that he denied is the one thing that was trying to trip him up. Doesn't that sound a lot like the Garden of Eden? Yes, sir. All of the trees, the fruit of all of the trees in the midst of the garden you may freely eat, but there's one tree, fruit thereof you cannot eat, and that's the one tree that they ate of, and just like you said, no new tricks, just new victims. Go ahead, sis.
I think Joseph also realized that what had started out as something that was meant for bad for him turned out to be something good. I mean, back to the, him being entrusted, with all that Potiphar had. He bought him as a slave, but he moved him into his house, gave him this high position because he said himself there was nobody else there in that house that was above him, in the position that he was in. And who would want to mess that up, considering what you had gone through and how your own family had treated you and put you in that position in the first place. So he had a lot to be thankful for. So why would he mess that up if that was the only thing that he
Yeah.
was not allowed to.
And that too is a lesson for us, because in every temptation, whenever you are faced with something, stop, think about the consequences of it. Think about the big picture. Think about, does this moment, this brief moment of instant gratification, is it worth messing up all of this? You see? Apparently Joseph factored all that into his decision, not to sleep with this woman, because he realized that this one brief encounter was going to mess him up big time for a long time. But let me get back to, go ahead, Sister Danary.
And I don't think that it was that Joseph wasn't tempted by the woman, because the way he took out running out of there. So, I mean, it's not like Joseph was a crazy. He was a young man, and then he got a experienced woman thrown in his face. So it's not like he wasn't tempted. That's why he got out of there as fast as he did, because if he'd have hung around there, the story might be different.
Yeah.
And so,
Which is another point. Sometimes the answer may be, run!
That's right. Amen. Amen.
It don't matter what people call you.
That's right.
They can call you punk, call you weak, call you whatever they want to call you. You run. Sometimes that may be your only way out, to run. Literally, run.
But what I liked about Joseph is that when his wife was, Potiphar's wife was tempting him, he didn't let the fact that he was so far away from everybody and the loneliness sit in, because people forget that he was also tempted on that level too. And if he would have failed that test when he got to the palace, he would have been unqualified, because you remember how his father that could not resist women, like as you spoke about in the other lesson, who had trouble resisting women, he did that. He was able to stand up and learn from his father's mistakes also. And if you get into the palace and you have not learned, then, and you fell in all these tests, God wanted you to be an A student, but you became a C student.
Potiphar's wife got Joseph based upon circumstantial evidence. Because Joseph did what he needed to do to get out of that situation, and that was to physically run away from this woman. But he left his coat. And she used his coat, circumstantial evidence, to fabricate a story about him. And the thing that blew my mind is Potiphar didn't even give Joseph a chance to tell his side of the story. Once he heard what his wife had to say, he was so outraged, so he just lost everything. Now here's a man who's blessed him, blessed his house, blessed his business, blessed his life. But all that went out the window with the thought of him touching his wife or trying to touch his wife. He lost his own blessing. Isn't that right? Go ahead, bro. The reason why Joseph ran, the reason why he didn't take advantage of an opportunity that most 17-year-olds would have jumped on, was because of his commitment to God, because of his commitment to his employer, to his master. Isn't that right? Now, think about it. Personal question here. How many of you, after being falsely accused, wrongly convicted, how many of you will still have faith in God? And see, that's going to bring us to our next stop in our next lesson. But the lesson at this stop was that Joseph learned some valuable skills. Now, he already learned the lesson, what he needed to learn. He learned about the managerial skill. Now, I don't know at the time that Potiphar's wife accused him if he was still 17. I'm sure some time has elapsed. It doesn't say how much time, but he may not have been 17. It may have been 19, 20, 21. Because if you look at the timeline, by the time he gets to Potiphar's house, to Pharaoh, he's 30 years old. That's 13 years. So somewhere between 17 and 30 is where he is when this story happens. Doesn't tell us how long that was. Go ahead, bro. There are some people, well, let me just preface what I'm about to say with this. The Bible does teach, Romans chapter 9, I believe it is, God uses whom he wants to use, and the way he wants to use them. That's why he used Pharaoh, to keep his people oppressed and to do all these things. But some people take that argument and say, well, my life is predestined by God, right or wrong, whatever happens in my life, that's the way God wanted to do. And people who are serial killers and people who have committed some of the worst atrocities, against mankind have used that argument and said, well, that's the way God predestined my life. That's what God chose for me to do. Problem with that is, God is not that kind of God. God doesn't make people do evil. We are free moral agents. We have free will. We choose. God does have a purpose and a design for all of our lives. But we have within us the power to choose, to not live our lives according to the purpose that God has for our lives. Now, it is the case that sometimes God will send us through some stuff to kind of get us back on track with that will. In fact, that's what he does with all of us. He chastens us because he loves us. He chastises us to get it back on line. But we have to decide to get back in line. We can choose to stay out of line and die outside of the will of God. People do that every day. You see what I'm saying? So there are some people who take the argument you just gave to the extreme and say that God made Hitler do what he did. No, God didn't make Hitler do what he did. See, Hitler chose to do what he did. You see the point? I saw your hand up, Patrick, a while ago.
Joseph had many journeys in his path. Right. I mean, on his road. And he had enemies along the way. And it doesn't matter how people try and hurt you when you have favor in God's eyesight. Because when people see that God is elevating you to a higher level, you're going to have more and more and more enemies. But the scripture that I wanted to leave is Proverbs 16:7. It says, when a man ways please the Lord, he make even his enemies be at peace with him.
Amen. Thank you, sis. Read the rest of the story. Your reading assignment for next week is read about his next stop in the prison. Okay? And we'll talk about that next week. Okay, Tim.